In the summer of 1953, a storm swept through Michigan, a storm so devastating it claimed 116 lives in just 3 minutes. For those who lived through it, it was a moment of sheer terror. For the rest of the world, it was a disaster nearly erased from history. But why? How could something so catastrophic be so quickly forgotten by those in power? This isn't just a story of a deadly tornado. It's a story of a government that chose silence in the face of overwhelming destruction. So, what really happened on that fateful day in Flint and Beecher? And why did the storm remain a shadow in the history books for so long? Let's dive into the storm that changed lives, but not always in the way we might expect. Before we get into this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you think the truth deserves to be heard. Your support helps us uncover these untold stories. Imagine waking up on June 8, 1953, in Flint, Michigan, a day like any other. The sun is out, people are going about their daily routines, children heading to school, workers clocking in, and families gearing up for the summer. Life in Beecher, a nearby township, is no different. It's a place where folks knew each other by name, where the sounds of laughter echoed down the streets. But there was a hidden tension in the air, something subtle yet ominous. The weather had been unusual lately. Over the past few days, a series of storms had rolled in from the Midwest, leaving a trail of thick clouds and oppressive humidity. For most, it seemed like just another summer thunderstorm. But no one knew what was coming. In the early afternoon, the skies darkened and the winds began to pick up. People looked up, confused, even a little nervous, but no one could have predicted the fury that was about to descend upon them. The calm before the storm was a cruel illusion. By the time the tornado touched down in Beecher, it was too late for any kind of escape. The calm had shattered, and what followed would change the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, forever. It was the kind of thing you read about in history books or see in movies, but this was real. And it was about to be far worse than anyone could imagine. It struck like a beast unleashed. In the blink of an eye, the peaceful summer afternoon turned into an unrecognizable nightmare. One moment, the streets of Beecher were calm, and the next, a massive, violent twister roared across the landscape. With winds reaching up to 250 miles per hour, this wasn't just any tornado. It was a monster, an EF5, the deadliest classification a tornado can hold. Imagine being caught in the sheer force of a moving freight train. Yet it's not a train. It's a swirling vortex of destruction that devours everything in its path. The tornado touched down just outside the town, initially cutting through fields and scattered homes. But as it tore through Beecher and into Flint, it left nothing untouched. Trees were uprooted, houses were flattened, and the very ground seemed to tremble under its fury. People who had heard the warnings, if they even had time to listen, had little more than seconds to act. By the time the storm passed, just 3 minutes had gone by. 3 minutes. That was all it took to devastate an entire community. In those moments, the tornado didn't just take lives, it ripped through families, homes, and futures. It was over before anyone could grasp the scale of what was happening. And yet, in the aftermath, something even stranger occurred. The government, local officials, and even the press seemed to go silent. What happened after the storm was just as shocking as the destruction it left behind. When the storm finally subsided, the devastation was almost incomprehensible. Flint and Beecher were left in ruins, buildings reduced to rubble, roads blocked by debris, and lives shattered in a matter of minutes. But what's even more baffling is what came next: silence. In the wake of the disaster, the town waited for help to arrive. The victims, the survivors, and the families of those lost all stood in shock, hoping that the authorities would step in to offer support, provide aid, and begin the long road to recovery. But nothing came. No emergency response teams. No government officials rushing to the scene. No national media storming in with cameras to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. The storm left a hole in the ground and a hole in the heart of the community. But even worse was the feeling that the outside world didn't seem to care. Locals began to gather what little they could from the wreckage. Volunteers, neighbors, and people from surrounding areas started coming together, offering whatever assistance they could. But the resources were limited, and the task of clearing the debris seemed insurmountable. And yet, the official response remained bafflingly muted. Why wasn't the government responding with urgency? Why was the media so quiet about the disaster? The survivors, many of them already grieving and physically wounded, now found themselves battling a much deeper wound: the silence of the system that was supposed to protect them. Despite the overwhelming scale of the destruction, something strange began to unfold. The tornado, which had torn through two communities in a matter of minutes, was quickly forgotten by the world. The media barely covered it. The disaster didn't make headlines. The lack of press coverage raised eyebrows, but it wasn't immediately clear why. Why had such a powerful storm, one that killed 116 people, barely registered outside of Flint and Beecher? The government seemed reluctant to label it as a major disaster, and the press didn't pick up the story with the urgency it deserved. In the weeks that followed, many residents started asking the same question: why was this tragedy being ignored? The silence seemed almost intentional, as if the devastation was being downplayed for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. Had the storm been deemed just another tornado to the authorities? Or was there something more to it, some sort of political or social reluctance to address what had happened? The victims and survivors watched as the world turned its gaze elsewhere. With no official response to the scale of the damage, they were left to deal with the aftermath alone. As the recovery efforts unfolded in a quiet, almost disjointed manner, people started to wonder: had this storm been too inconvenient for those in power to acknowledge? Was this a story of neglect or something far darker? The silence from the authorities didn't just affect the news cycle. It had a profound emotional toll on the community. For the people of Flint and Beecher, the tornado wasn't just a tragedy, it was a personal betrayal. Families were torn apart, homes vanished, and livelihoods were shattered. The survivors were left to sift through the wreckage of their lives, without the reassurance that help was on the way. The government, the one entity that was supposed to step in and restore order, seemed to have turned a blind eye. But it wasn't just the absence of aid that caused pain, it was the emotional weight of being ignored. Imagine losing everything and not hearing a word from those who should be there to help you rebuild. For months, residents struggled to pick up the pieces, not just of their homes, but of their spirits. They faced the physical scars of the disaster, but there were deeper, invisible wounds, the trauma of feeling abandoned in their darkest hour. Yet, even in the face of such hardship, something remarkable happened. The people of Flint and Beecher didn't wait for help that never came. They came together, relying on one another to survive. Neighbors opened their homes to strangers, sharing what little they had. Volunteers from surrounding areas poured in. But it was the community itself that became the true hero in the wake of the storm. In their unity, they found a strength that the government had refused to offer. The government's response, or rather, the lack of it, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado disaster. When disaster strikes, we expect immediate action: emergency services, government support, federal aid. But for Flint and Beecher, there was nothing. No national disaster declaration, no influx of aid from the federal government, not even a public statement acknowledging the scale of the loss. What could explain this? Was it just a case of bureaucratic oversight, or was there something more intentional at play? It's easy to dismiss this as a simple failure of local government or miscommunication, but the truth is far more complex. In the years following the disaster, many survivors and historians began to connect the dots. This was a time when certain communities, particularly working-class, predominantly African-American communities like Beecher, were often overlooked or outright ignored by those in power. The social and political climate of the 1950s made it easier for disasters like this to be swept under the rug, especially in areas that were already struggling. Was it a matter of racial or class-based indifference? Or was there a political calculation at work, where acknowledging the disaster might have brought unwanted attention to areas that weren't seen as politically important? Either way, the silence from the government was deafening, and the people who lived through the storm were left to wonder why they hadn't mattered enough to be heard. While the government and media stood silent, the real heroes of the Flint Beecher tornado disaster emerged from the heart of the community itself. It was the people who lived through the chaos who became the first responders, the caregivers, the builders of hope in a time of hopelessness. There was no government intervention, no FEMA teams rushing in, but there was something much more powerful, an unwavering sense of solidarity. Neighbors helped neighbors, volunteers arrived from surrounding areas, and local organizations banded together to provide food, shelter, and medical care. Ordinary people became heroes without titles. People who had just lost everything were the ones digging through the rubble, pulling out survivors, and offering comfort to the grieving. In the face of destruction, they didn't wait for permission to act. They just did. They understood that if they didn't step up, no one else would. Among these heroes were the teachers, shop owners, and factory workers, individuals who knew how to come together in a crisis, even when the state chose not to. But there were also quieter heroes, the families who lost loved ones yet still found the strength to offer what little they had left. They were the emotional backbone of this community, holding it together when the world had turned away. In the midst of disaster, the real resilience was found in the hearts of the people who didn't give up, no matter how hard it got. In the aftermath of the 1953 tornado, a strange thing started happening. Myths began to swirl, almost as if the storm itself wasn't enough to grasp. When a disaster this large strikes, there's a natural tendency to seek explanations, to try and make sense of the chaos. People want to understand why something so devastating happened. And often, that leads to the spread of rumors and misunderstandings. It's almost as if, in our desire to make meaning, we distort reality. One of the most persistent myths that emerged was about the nature of the tornado itself. Some claimed that the storm was a freak occurrence, an anomaly in the weather patterns that couldn't possibly have been predicted. But the truth is, tornadoes like the one that hit Flint and Beecher are not as rare as people believed. In fact, the region had a history of tornado activity. The real anomaly was the unprecedented speed and strength with which this storm struck. Yet, many locals and even some reporters downplayed the severity, referring to the storm as just another run-of-the-mill twister. Another myth that took root was the idea that the tornado's path was random and that no one could have prepared for it. While tornadoes are inherently unpredictable, it was clear from weather reports that conditions were ripe for a storm like this. But, due to the lack of government and media attention, many people were left unaware of how serious the situation was, making it all too easy to label it as something entirely out of anyone's control. Flint, Michigan, has often been considered a tornado-prone area, but it wasn't until the 1953 disaster that the full force of that reality hit home. As the tornado devastated Beecher and Flint, questions began to surface. Was this a freak event, or had the community been living in the shadow of something more dangerous all along? Looking back, it's clear that Flint had experienced tornadoes before, but none with the sheer magnitude and terror of the 1953 storm. The region is located in what's known as Tornado Alley, a vast area of the United States where tornadoes are more common due to unique weather conditions. Hot, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico colliding with cooler, drier air from Canada. This makes the area ripe for violent storms. But what's truly shocking is that despite these recurring events, Flint wasn't adequately prepared for a storm of this scale. Local infrastructure, emergency response systems, and even public awareness were far from what they should have been. The tornado didn't just devastate the physical landscape. It exposed the vulnerabilities that had been ignored for far too long. In hindsight, the 1953 tornado was a wake-up call. It was a reminder that the region had long been at risk, but the failure to address this risk made the tornado all the more catastrophic. And while the community rebuilt, the question remained, why hadn't Flint been better prepared to face this kind of disaster? In the months that followed the tornado, the people of Flint and Beecher faced an enormous challenge, rebuilding not just their homes, but their lives. The destruction was so widespread that it felt as though the community was starting from scratch. For many survivors, their homes, their businesses, and even their sense of normalcy had been swept away in those 3 minutes of devastation. But what the storm couldn't destroy was their determination. The rebuilding process began slowly, with volunteers pouring in from surrounding areas, offering what help they could. Local businesses opened their doors to provide supplies, and makeshift shelters were set up to house those who had lost everything. But despite the outpouring of support from ordinary citizens, the recovery efforts were frustratingly fragmented. Government aid was slow to arrive, and the red tape seemed endless. People were left wondering why they had to rely on each other, on their neighbors, instead of the institutions they were taught to trust in times of crisis. Even as the physical structures were rebuilt, the emotional scars remained. Survivors carried the trauma of the event with them for years. Families that had lost loved ones, children who had lost their homes, and the residents who had lived through the horror were forced to face the psychological aftermath of such a violent, sudden disaster. The rebuilding wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about mending hearts and minds. But through it all, something remarkable happened. Flint and Beecher didn't just rebuild. They began to redefine themselves. They transformed from victims of an unimaginable disaster into a testament to resilience. Tornadoes are nature's most violent storms, capable of wiping entire towns off the map in mere minutes. But what exactly makes them so devastating, especially one like the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado? It's not just the raw power, but also the unpredictability and the speed at which these storms develop. Scientists have long studied the forces that give rise to tornadoes, trying to understand how and why they wreak such havoc. Tornadoes form when warm, moist air collides with cold, dry air, creating a recipe for chaos. In the case of the Flint Beecher tornado, this collision of air masses set the stage for a storm of unprecedented speed and strength. The conditions in Michigan on that fateful day were perfect for the creation of a supercell, a large, rotating thunderstorm capable of producing deadly tornadoes. Once the storm formed, it grew rapidly, gaining power in a matter of minutes. Tornadoes like this one often appear without much warning, making them incredibly dangerous. Even with today's advanced weather technology, predicting the exact path and timing of a tornado remains a challenge. In 1953, there was no radar to track the storm in real time and very little public awareness of tornado safety. What made this tornado particularly destructive wasn't just its strength, it was its speed. Moving at an astonishing pace, the storm left communities with virtually no time to react. This combination of factors turned what could have been just another powerful tornado into an unprecedented tragedy. As the tornado devastated Flint and Beecher, it wasn't just the physical damage that seemed to vanish, it was the very political will to acknowledge it. Why did the government, both local and national, remain so silent? Why was there no immediate public outcry, no swift political response to help the victims, despite the magnitude of the disaster? At the time, Michigan was dealing with numerous social and political tensions, many of which would soon shape the way disasters were handled. The 1950s were a period marked by political unease, racial segregation, and a sense of social and economic inequality. Flint, with its predominantly working-class and African-American population, wasn't viewed as a key political or economic hub. For many in power, the tornado was simply another unfortunate, yet somewhat insignificant, event in a less important part of the state. This political indifference seemed to echo a larger trend where the voices of marginalized communities were often overlooked, especially in times of crisis. The Flint Beecher tornado served as a glaring example of this systemic neglect. Local officials were slow to act, and the state's response was lackluster at best. National recognition of the disaster, even by the media, remained almost non-existent. While the survivors struggled to rebuild their homes, they were also left to rebuild their faith in the political system. Why were they not worth the same attention given to wealthier or more politically connected regions? This is a question that still lingers, even as we look back on the disaster today. When disaster strikes, we turn to the press to guide us through the chaos, to inform us, and to hold power accountable. But in the case of the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado, the media failed to do any of these things. Despite the horror unfolding in real time, the tornado barely made a blip on the national radar. Newspapers in nearby cities like Detroit reported the basics, but the coverage was sparse, and the gravity of the situation was lost in the short blurbs and brief mentions. It was as if the storm had been relegated to a footnote in history, a disaster too easily forgotten. The role of the press in shaping public perception cannot be overstated. In moments of tragedy, the press has the power to bring attention to critical issues, to demand action from authorities, and to give a voice to the voiceless. Yet, in this case, it seemed as if the press either didn't see the storm as newsworthy or was deliberately withholding coverage. The focus seemed to shift quickly to other, less devastating stories. Why was this? Was it because of the racial and economic makeup of the affected communities? Was the disaster simply too inconvenient for the media to cover in depth? Without the media's usual firepower to push for aid or recovery efforts, Flint and Beecher were left to fend for themselves. The victims of the tornado didn't just have to fight the storm. They had to fight for their story to be told. In the years following the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado, many of the victims who survived the storm were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. But as the years passed, their stories seemed to fade into obscurity, just like the disaster itself. The people who lost family members, homes, and businesses had to rebuild without the recognition or support they so desperately needed. In many ways, their lives became a testament to resilience. Surviving the tornado was one battle, but surviving the aftermath, emotionally and financially, was another. But what happened to these survivors? The toll of the disaster didn't end when the storm passed. Many of the families that had been devastated by the tornado struggled for years to recover. The lack of adequate government aid meant that rebuilding wasn't just about clearing rubble. It was about overcoming poverty, dealing with trauma, and fighting against the political silence that had left them abandoned. For some, this meant leaving Flint in search of a fresh start, while others stayed behind, haunted by what they'd lost. For those who stayed, life went on, but it was never the same. The psychological scars left by the tornado were deep, and for many, the effects lingered for decades. They didn't just lose their homes, they lost their sense of security and trust in the systems that were supposed to protect them. As for the victims who died, their families often found that their grief was overlooked and their loved ones' stories remained forgotten in the larger narrative of American history. For years, the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado was a silent tragedy, forgotten not just by the media, but by the public consciousness at large. As the decades passed, survivors, families, and advocates began to push for the recognition the storm had long been denied. It wasn't just about acknowledging the lives lost or the destruction. It was about honoring the people who had suffered, who had fought through unimaginable hardships, and who had been ignored in the aftermath. The fight for recognition didn't come easy. For many years, the tornado was dismissed as just another natural disaster, swept under the rug by political figures and media outlets eager to move on to the next big story. But for the people of Flint and Beecher, the storm was never something to be forgotten. It was a part of their shared history, one that shaped their communities, their identities, and their resilience. Over time, as the memory of the storm began to resurface, local activists, survivors, and historians began to demand that the tornado be remembered for what it was, a disaster that deserved recognition. Finally, after decades of silence, there began to be a movement to honor the victims, not just with memorials and plaques, but with a commitment to ensure that such tragedies were never again ignored. The fight for recognition was a long, hard battle, but in the end, it gave a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. In the wake of the 1953 tornado, Michigan, and particularly Flint and Beecher, were left to rebuild. Not just their homes, but their spirit. The tornado had shown the world just how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could be swept away by forces beyond our control. But through it all, Michigan demonstrated an unwavering resilience. The The communities that had been decimated by the storm didn't just rebuild their physical structures. They rebuilt their hearts, their families, and their futures. It wasn't just about putting up new walls and roofs. It was about restoring a sense of hope in community that had been shattered. Local leaders, volunteers, and survivors themselves became the architects of the recovery. They poured their energy into helping each other, into creating new foundations for the future. But the struggle was far from easy. The lack of government support had forced the community to be resourceful, to innovate, and to rely on their own strength. In the years that followed, Flint and Beecher would face more challenges, but the tornado would always be a symbol of their determination. The disaster had not broken them. It had strengthened their resolve. And though the pain of losing so many loved ones would never truly fade, the resilience of these communities became a reminder of the power of human connection, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The 1953 Flint Beecher tornado, though devastating, was far from an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of natural disasters that shaped the American experience, teaching the country tough lessons about disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. In the aftermath of this tornado, and others like it, the government and communities across the nation began to recognize the need for better infrastructure, clearer emergency protocols, and, perhaps most importantly, the role of media in informing and mobilizing the public. Yet, despite these lessons, many of the same challenges would resurface in the years to come. In the decades following 1953, America would face increasingly intense weather events: hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, and more powerful tornadoes. Each of these disasters would serve as a reminder of the destructive power of nature, but also of how crucial it is to have systems in place that can help communities recover. What set the Flint Beecher disaster apart, however, was the unique combination of government neglect and media silence, which made the recovery process all the more difficult. It highlighted how disasters, especially those that affect marginalized communities, can fall through the cracks when the political will is lacking. The Flint tornado may have been forgotten by many, but it set in motion a wave of change that would eventually lead to greater awareness of how the nation should respond to natural disasters, and how those who suffer from them should never be overlooked again. More than 6 decades after the devastating tornado of 1953, Flint and Beecher are vastly different from the communities they once were. The landscape has changed. New buildings have risen from the rubble, roads have been paved, and the scars of the storm have largely faded from view. Yet, the memories of that fateful day still linger, etched into the hearts of those who lived through it. Returning to Flint and Beecher today, you might not immediately see the traces of the destruction that once tore through the area. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the stories of the survivors, the older residents who remember the terror of the tornado and the quiet courage that followed in its wake. Their faces might be older now, their voices tinged with the sadness of what was lost, but the strength they carry with them is undeniable. These are the people who rebuilt, who transformed the devastation into a foundation for a new beginning. Visiting the site of the disaster, you can feel the weight of history pressing down on you. The land, though reborn, still bears the invisible scars of the tornado. The community's resilience is evident in every street and corner, but so too is the reminder that some wounds never fully heal. The recovery wasn't just about rebuilding homes, it was about rebuilding lives. And the legacy of the 1953 tornado, though forgotten by many, remains an integral part of Flint's story. As time passes, it's easy for the stories of the 116 lives lost in the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado to fade into the past, buried beneath layers of history. But for the families who still carry the grief, those lives are never forgotten. Every anniversary, every quiet moment of reflection, the memories of those lost are honored in small ways. Through memorials, through family gatherings, through the simple act of telling their story to younger generations. A tribute to the victims isn't just about acknowledging the lives that were lost. It's about acknowledging the pain that continues to ripple through the lives of those left behind. Many of the survivors went on to live full lives, but the shadow of that storm never fully left them. For those who lost family members, the tornado left a void that nothing could replace. The community itself was reshaped by the loss, each person affected by the tragedy in ways both seen and unseen. Over the years, Flint and Beecher have begun to recognize the magnitude of what happened in 1953. Memorials have been built, and plaques now stand in honor of the victims, ensuring that their memory remains alive. These physical reminders aren't just about the past. They serve as a testament to the strength of the survivors and the enduring legacy of those who were lost. The tornado may have silenced them in the immediate aftermath, but their stories are still being told. The 1953 Flint Beecher tornado left behind a legacy of loss and pain, but it also offered invaluable lessons, ones that shaped the way America would approach disaster preparedness in the future. One of the most significant takeaways from this storm was the realization that no community, regardless of its size or socioeconomic status, should ever be left to fend for itself in the wake of a disaster. The lack of timely government response highlighted the need for better disaster response protocols and greater investment in emergency infrastructure. In the decades that followed, lessons learned from Flint and Beecher led to substantial changes in how tornadoes and other natural disasters were handled. The federal government began to allocate more resources to disaster response, and agencies like FEMA were established to coordinate emergency relief efforts. Public awareness of tornado safety also grew, with local governments and meteorologists taking steps to ensure that communities had access to early warning systems. But perhaps the most important lesson from Flint tragedy was the strength of human resilience. Despite the systemic failures, the people of Flint and Beecher showed the world what true community solidarity looks like. They rebuilt not just their homes, but their lives, proving that in the face of unimaginable destruction, the human spirit can endure and rise above even the greatest of storms. The lessons learned in Flint and Beecher have not been forgotten. They serve as a constant reminder that, when disaster strikes, we must come together, not just as individuals, but as a collective force for change. In 1953, the technology to predict tornadoes was rudimentary at best. Weather radars were just beginning to emerge, and meteorologists had limited tools to track or analyze severe weather. This lack of foresight contributed to the devastating surprise of the Flint Beecher tornado, leaving the community with little time to react. Today, tornado prediction has come a long way. But even with the advances in technology, tornadoes remain one of nature's most unpredictable and dangerous forces. Modern tornado prediction relies heavily on radar systems like Doppler radar, which allows meteorologists to detect rotations in storm clouds that could indicate the formation of a tornado. These systems have revolutionized tornado tracking, offering precious lead time, sometimes up to 30 minutes, before a tornado strikes. This early warning gives communities a chance to seek shelter and prepare. Additionally, advances in weather modeling and atmospheric science have made it possible to study the conditions that lead to tornado formation, enabling meteorologists to issue more accurate forecasts. Despite these improvements, predicting the exact path of a tornado remains an ongoing challenge. The speed and intensity of a storm like the one that devastated Flint still make it difficult to provide adequate warning. However, modern technology has allowed us to mitigate the risk, giving communities the tools to respond more effectively. In many ways, the lessons learned from disasters like Flint have spurred these technological advancements, ultimately saving countless lives. The 1953 Flint Beecher tornado was a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of disasters and the vital importance of preparedness. For the residents of Flint and Beecher, the suddenness of the storm and the lack of early warning made the tragedy even more devastating. In the years since, disaster preparedness has become a priority for communities nationwide. But it's not just about having the right equipment or response plans in place. It's about fostering a culture of awareness and readiness. One of the most significant changes post-1953 has been the push to educate the public about how to respond to tornadoes and other natural disasters. Local governments and agencies now emphasize the need for individuals and families to have emergency plans, to know where to shelter, and to stay informed during severe weather events. Schools and businesses conduct drills, and weather stations provide continuous updates on potential risks. However, preparedness isn't just about individual action. It's about ensuring that communities have the resources they need to recover quickly in the event of a disaster. Stronger infrastructure, better access to emergency services, and more efficient communication systems are essential for minimizing the impact of future storms. The tragedy in Flint and Beecher underscored the need for swift, coordinated action from both local and national authorities, as well as the importance of a well-informed public that knows how to respond when disaster strikes. Over half a century has passed since the 1953 tornado tore through Flint and Beecher, leaving destruction in its wake. Yet, the echoes of that day still resonate in the community. Today, Flint and Beecher are not just places marked by tragedy. They're symbols of resilience, transformation, and the enduring power of a community coming together in the face of adversity. The tornado's legacy lives on in the people who survived it and the generations that followed. Flint, once known for its auto industry, now finds itself facing a new set of challenges. From economic downturns to the ongoing water crisis, the community has had to fight against forces that threaten to undo all the progress they've made. But what the tornado taught them remains true to this day. No matter how overwhelming the odds, the strength of the community can carry them through. Beecher, once a small township, has seen growth and revitalization, but the memory of the tornado has never been forgotten. Memorials stand in tribute to those lost and to the survivors who rebuilt their lives. Residents continue to honor the legacy of their predecessors, ensuring that future generations understand the significance of the 1953 disaster and the community's remarkable recovery. The tornado didn't just change the landscape, it changed the people who lived through it. The scars may remain, but so does their determination, a testament to the spirit of Flint and Beecher. In the years following the 1953 Flint-Beecher tornado, the most haunting aspect of the tragedy wasn't just the destruction, it was the silence that followed. The government's lack of acknowledgement, its refusal to label the event as the disaster it truly was, left the people of Flint and Beecher feeling abandoned. This storm, which killed 116 people and devastated entire communities, was never officially named in the way other disasters of its magnitude might have been. No formal disaster declaration, no widespread aid, and no public memorials or major media coverage. Just a community left to pick up the pieces on its own. Why did this happen? Was it because the tornado hit an area deemed politically insignificant? Or was it because the communities affected were marginalized and often overlooked? The political silence surrounding this tragedy continues to spark debate. Many believe that if the tornado had hit a wealthier, more politically connected area, the response would have been far different. Instead, it was as if the victims' lives were worth less, their suffering too inconvenient to address. But despite being ignored by the powers that be, the story of the 1953 Flint-Beecher tornado lived on. In the absence of recognition from the government, it was the people themselves who kept the memory alive, refusing to let the storm be forgotten. The storm may have been silenced by those in charge, but the voices of the survivors and victims echoed loudly, ensuring that the tragedy would never be erased from history. The 1953 Flint-Beecher tornado may have been forgotten by many, but for those who lived through it, the memory remains vivid, alive in their hearts and minds. Over the decades, efforts have been made to ensure that the storm and its victims are not lost to history. From memorial plaques to community events, the memory of that fateful day is being kept alive, not just for those who survived, but for future generations who may never know the full extent of the storm's destruction. Why does it matter? Why should we remember a tragedy that, for many, happened long before their time? The answer lies in the power of memory. Honoring the victims, the survivors, and the heroes who emerged in the aftermath is a way of ensuring that the lessons learned from this disaster aren't forgotten.